Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. Say, kids, what time is it? It's Howdy Doody time. Or, who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me? Or how about, this may resonate with more people than you think, who lives in a pineapple under the sea? SpongeBob SquarePants. Yeah, just three iconic lines from famous kids' television shows. Many of us have fond memories of growing up watching children's television, whether it was early in the morning watching Captain Kangaroo before I went to school, or running home after school to catch what was on TV, or how about that Saturday morning lineup? Well, needless to say, watching TV has been a passion of many, many people, including my guest. Jo Holz has been a television fan all her life. She traces her fascination with the medium back to those early TV shows that she watched as a child. That fascination with kids' television led her to work as the head of the research department for the company that produces Sesame Street. She was senior vice president at Nielsen and a television research executive for NBC and Oxygen Media. Jo Holz is also a former professional in residence at the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the author of the book, Kids TV Grows Up, the definitive social history of children's television in America from its inception to the present. Jo, thanks so much for being with us here on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Children's television is a topic I know very near and dear to your heart, as well as mine. I mentioned those three iconic lines here at the beginning of the show. I can't say that I was there for the original run of Howdy Doody or the Mickey Mouse Club. However, SpongeBob SquarePants is definitely part of the television watching habit of my children, and Mr. Rogers, Sesame Street, the list goes on and on and on. So what was your fascination with this topic?
Well, you know, I was actually an immigrant to this country, came here when I was 4 years old, and I watched, we got a television set right away, and that was in the early days of Howdy Doody and those kinds of shows, The Lone Ranger.
Yeah.
And I used those shows to learn the language, to learn English, to learn about the country and the culture, and so they were very meaningful to me. And I've always had, as you say, fond memories of those shows. And so the idea for this book was really sort of percolating in me for a long time. And then when I was working at Sesame Street as head of research, you know, I found out that a lot had been written about Sesame Street and how it sort of fit into its time and its culture. But there wasn't a book that really dealt with sort of how television shows for children had evolved and changed over the years. And so that's really where I got the idea for the book.
I have to ask, because coming to this country as an immigrant and watching television, did you think that everybody walked around with a puppet and was Buffalo Bob Smith, or that we all walked around with mouse ears, or even in the case of, you know, Fess Parker, we all had, you know, coonskin caps on?
You know, actually we all did have coonskin caps, but that was because people went out and bought them.
Yeah, you're right.
No, I think what I did think was that, you know, a lot of the shows sort of depicted this idyllic suburban setting in those days, in the early 1950s, and I lived in the city, and I thought that everybody else must be living out in the suburbs in a ranch house, and you know, having you know, mom at home in a shirtwaist dress, you know, so I did. I mean, I think children do think that what they're seeing on television is the norm in some ways, but I think kids can tell the difference between fantasy and reality in many cases.
I think many cases today, but I still wonder back in the 1950s, because it was a different time, a different place.
Right.
And you know, television back then in its infancy was sort of a form of entertainment. I mean, it was entertainment.
Absolutely.
Today, I think children's television has become more than entertainment. It really has become informative and educational. So where did we go from, or how did we get from children's TV as being entertainment to today being a little bit of entertainment, information, and education?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think all television is educational. Some of it is explicitly educational, intended to be educational. Some of it is intended to be purely entertainment, but I think it teaches us something always. I think we always learn from it. Having said that, I think that in the early days of television, it was, interestingly, when it was first invented, parents saw it as very much an educational tool for their children, not in the sense of teaching the ABCs, but of sort of bringing the wider world into the living room and exposing their children to broader things that they might not, see in their own home, their own town or village or city. So parents thought this would be a great tool for their kids, and it's one reason why people who had children, bought a lot of the early television sets. Now, the first shows for children were, meant to be entertainment. However, there were a couple of early educational shows. There was a show called Ding Dong School, which was kind of a precursor of Mr. Rogers in a way. It was a single performer, a sort of matronly, motherly woman. She actually had been a teacher. Her name was Miss Francis. I watched this show, so it's pretty vivid for me. And she would basically sit there and talk to the children out in TV land. It was a preschool show, and she would ask the children, how are you today? What have you been doing? What's been fun? And then wait and pause for the answer.
Yeah.
And there'd be silence. And she would do little arts and crafts projects on the show, but she spoke directly to the camera, very much like Mr. Rogers did later. And there were several other early educational shows. So I think it's always been kind of a mix of entertainment and education. And of course, many years later, the FCC passed some rules requiring a certain amount of children's programming to be explicitly educational. So that produced a whole raft of educational shows, some of which were educational in the sense of teaching morals and values. So it got to the point where you could call almost any show educational, and local stations tried to do that. So that's one way that things have evolved.
Did the FCC step in because there was the fear that kids were being exploited, or that kids were buying into this this image of everything is happy and wonderful, and oh, by the way, mom and dad, can I buy that mouse ears, or the coonskin cap, or the Winky Dig screen that I remember to go on the front of the television. So, so what really prompted the FCC to get involved?
Well, yes, there were concerns of that kind, and there was a kind of a grassroots organization called Action for Children's Television. A woman named Peggy Charon started that as a group of mothers in Newton, Massachusetts, out in the suburbs. A group of concerned mothers who didn't like all the advertising, the commercialism on television. They didn't like what they saw as violent content, but mostly it was a concern about advertising. And they formed an organization which got, picked up a lot of support. They petitioned the FCC, they lobbied, and they knew how to use PR, they knew how to get press coverage, and in the end, I would attribute some of the regulation, and at first there was a lot of self-regulation. The networks decided to try to preempt government regulation by passing their own internal controls, but they were pushed along by Action for Children's Television, ACT, which formed in the late 1960s.
And then the game changer arrives on the scene, and that would be PBS, and it would be Sesame Workshop, and then Sesame Street, and then of course Fred Rogers and many of the other shows that we saw on PBS. But a game changer because they were tapping into some of the foundation of children's television, you know, with puppets, let's say, and you know, and Fred Rogers talking directly to the camera, like you mentioned, you know, the other woman early in the history of children's TV, but it was different. It wasn't as commercial or commercialized like some of these other shows.
Right.
So the game changer was the arrival of Sesame Street and Fred Rogers.
I think you're right about that. I mean, there were no commercials, although Sesame Street, you know, used the format of commercials to create their little skits that sold, right, letters and numbers and concepts. So they borrowed from the techniques of commercials, which they were criticized for at the time. But yeah, I think, you know, that was the first wave of non-commercial programming for children, and I think both, you know, Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street were groundbreaking shows, each in their own way, that really affected television for children from that point on, and I think improved it.
Yeah. When you were with Sesame Workshop, when you were with Sesame Street, they constantly pushed the envelope in that they were trying to not necessarily sugarcoat, you know, the world for kids, but to address issues in the manner that kids could understand. And I guess the effective way to do that was to have this colorful bunch of puppets, Muppets, whatever you want to call them, characters, to sort of speak to the kids directly and really tackle a whole variety of topics, whether it was, you know, AIDS, or whether today autism, or, you know, same-sex marriage, or having two parents of the same. I mean, they really have tackled every contemporary issue that is out there.
Yeah, they really have, and I think that's important to note. And Sesame Street, even its setting, was a total break with other children's television shows. They were not set in some suburban paradise. They were not set in some fantasy land. They were actually set on a city street with garbage cans. Grover lived in one of them. I mean, Oscar, the Grouch, lived in one of them. But they had a kind of a gritty looking setting. They were racially integrated, which you didn't see very much on television in those days. And they set out to tackle important topics and real topics, aspects of reality that other children's shows did not approach at all. Although we have to give some credit to Mr. Rogers, to Fred Rogers, because he did the same thing, although in a kind of a gentler way.
And you know, I call 2018 the year of Fred Rogers because there have been so many milestones that have been marked, and of course there's a full-length feature movie coming out in 2019 starring Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers. But I didn't realize just the amount of impact Fred Rogers had in this medium of children's television, so much so that if there was something during the production that he didn't necessarily feel was right or he felt was wrong, he would stop the production and correct it, but would literally stop the production and consult with, you know, experts to say, should we be saying this, should we be saying that, should we be doing this or doing that, which in today's standards in television, regardless if it's children's TV or network television at night, is pretty much unheard of.
Right, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it doesn't happen today,
Yeah, well, Fred Rogers was very serious about what he was doing. He had enormous respect for children. He didn't talk down to them, he didn't want to. He thought that children, you owed it to children to be honest with them, but in a way that was appropriate for their level. So he cared a great deal, and I think he was an amazing communicator and had a very good sense of, in fact, he studied child development in college, and he had a really good sense of how to talk to children in their own language, in their own terms. At Sesame Street, there was a board of advisors who were child development experts, the staff, the writers, the producers, many of them were child development experts, and Sesame Street tested their programming with children constantly to make sure that children actually were understanding the concepts and learning the concepts. So I think both of those shows were both entertaining and educational, and managed to create a very powerful blend, right, of those two goals.
So here we are in 2018, and we're talking about the state of children's television, and in some respects, it seems like it has swung back to those early days where you can't help getting through a children's television show without them cutting to commercials, talking about the latest and greatest toy,
Right.
for kids.
Right.
And it seems like, has, ACT, the group that you mentioned, for
Action for Children's
television.
Yeah.
And the FCC, are they all looking away now, or they're no longer concerned about it, or they just shrug their shoulders and say, well, it is what it is. We
Right.
have to make money. In order to make money to make these shows, we have to sell advertising. So just
Yep.
give me your current
Well,
state of children's TV.
the broadcast networks basically got out of the children's television business, because once these self-imposed rules and government regulations came down, they could not find a way to make the children's television business profitable for them anymore. So, because one of the rules was it cut down on the amount of commercial time
Yeah.
that could be included in a children's television show. So they essentially got out of the business. So there's no more Saturday morning
Right.
broadcast TV for children anymore. It gravitated towards cable, public television,
Yeah.
which doesn't have the commercials. Cable television doesn't have that kind of regulation.
Sure.
So they can pretty much do what they want. You have networks like Nickelodeon, which have their own sort of self-imposed rules. But other than that, it's kind of what each network feels is appropriate, feels is best for them. And then, of course, we have the internet, which is kind of a Wild West.
Yeah, and it's funny because you mentioned the internet, and it seems like not necessarily kids today, but parents of kids and grandparents are going and watching many of the shows that they grew up on.
Right.
And and then when you show it to kids today, they look at it and they're like, "What the heck are you looking at?" Because I guess kids have become savvy consumers
They have.
of television. If it doesn't have all the special effects and all the glitz and glamour, dare I say, show them a black and white television show from the 1950s, they're totally bored by it
That's
today.
true. Although I have to say, reruns of Sesame Street, I
Yeah.
think, hold up well. But preschoolers are another category. And,
Yeah.
you can show them things. I think those shows are inherently entertaining and they age well. On the other hand, in doing the research for my book, even I as an adult, looking back at black and white, kinescopes and video of some of these old shows, they're so slow.
Yeah.
They seem so slow. So yeah, I think our tastes and our sensibilities have changed, and certainly children's tastes and sensibilities have changed. On the other hand, I think that there are some incredibly sophisticated shows for children now. I call them postmodern shows, and I think SpongeBob SquarePants is an example of a show like that. Adventure Time, which is still on the air but not in original production anymore, which are way more sophisticated and nuanced, I think, than the earliest shows in the early days, because kids can appreciate and understand shows like that now. So definitely, children's television has changed tremendously since when I was a child.
Yeah. Taking the PBS shows out of the equation, like Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and maybe even Reading Rainbow, and there are a whole other set of PBS shows. But I mean, what would you consider the top 2 or 3 children's television shows of all time?
Wow.
And I know that's a it's a big question because there's so many years of it.
Right. Well, I definitely have to start with SpongeBob.
Okay.
Because it's been hugely, hugely popular for so long, actually. And it's definitely an iconic show. And I got to start with the Howdy Doody show, because that was the iconic puppet / circus show of its day, and that was an entire genre, right, that was popular. Now, between those two, it's hard to say. There was, of course, I would say Pokemon, the TV show, was a groundbreaking show, and it started a whole sort of era of Japanese-influenced cartoons for children, and that was definitely an era. And honestly, I think even like Pee-wee's Playhouse, you know, whatever you may think of Pee Wee Herman, Paul Rubens, was a very creative and groundbreaking show. It had a retro look to it, but it was a very rich, creative show. So those are just a few that come to mind.
When you decided to write this book and you delved into this topic, what was it you hoped that readers of the book would take away? Because it is a trip down memory lane, and you touch upon so many of the fond memories that we have about children's television when we were growing up. But what is it that you hope is the takeaway with the book for readers?
You know, my goal was to show how, if you look at the whole history of children's television, back to the late 1940s and on, it's a way of looking at how our concept of children has changed over time. It's a way of looking at how our parenting ideas have changed, and really you can kind of see a reflection of how our values, our morals, you know, so many things have changed since the 40s, and children's television, like television for adults, has to reflect that. So you know, to me, you know, you can kind of look beneath the surface of these shows and realize how far we've come in some ways, maybe not in all ways, but in some ways, in terms of how we treat children, what we think is entertaining for them, what we think is not good for them, and those ideas have changed.
As television evolves, and I think, you know, based with your work at Nielsen, I mean, you know, it's a numbers game, and at the end of the day, if the numbers are there and you're doing really well, great. But if those numbers begin to slide, then there are changes that are likely going to take effect. But as we sort of segue from traditional broadcast to, you know, the internet, and viewing habits start to change now. I mean, do you see not only children's television, but television in general, looking at the big picture and wondering, okay, where are we going with this? And namely, when Sesame Street went from PBS into this partnership with HBO, it was a dramatic change or shift in the way PBS was doing Sesame Street.
Yeah, for sure. Although, you know, Sesame Street is still on PBS.
Yes,
right. So the HBO partnership, yes, it was. It caused a lot of concern, and people kind of threw up their hands. And here was a show that was originated to help inner city children, and now they're partnering with HBO. But it's really a financing measure for them. But it speaks to your question because you know, viewership for Sesame Street has gone down. You know, it's not the #1 show even for preschoolers anymore. And sources of income for Sesame Street have dropped. There isn't the level of government funding. There isn't the level of foundation funding that there used to be. And you know, the DVD business was a big business for Sesame Street, and that's no longer a business. So things have changed a lot, and definitely viewing of television by children, by teens, is down dramatically because of the internet. And so yes, I think that the television industry is going through huge changes. Many of them are finding out ways to work with the internet very successfully, others not so much. There still is a television business. I think there still will be for many years to come, but it's definitely changing.
Yeah, for sure. In the minute or two that we have left here, where do you see children's television going in the future then?
You know, I think that there is just going to be a lot more kind of multimedia programming for children, where the television program is just one part of the experience, right? So there's the online experience, the digital experience. You know, children are using iPads phones,
Yeah.
not just the big TV set in the living room, but I think the TV set's not going away either. So I think it's much more a blend of media.
I have to ask, does the theme park experience also figure into this? Because, you know, here in the Philadelphia region, we were fortunate enough to have the only theme park themed after the Sesame Street characters. Now I think there's talk of building, you know, other theme parks based on that. So I mean, does that take it to a whole other level with the theme park experience?
I think absolutely. And you know, if you think back, it was Walt Disney and Disney World that created this idea. And it was a brilliant idea that Disney had. And he planned the theme park and then a television show to be synergistic with each other, right? The television show drove people to the theme parks.
That's right.
The theme parks got people to watch the TV show. And of course you have Universal now doing that, Lego. I mean, everyone wants to have a theme park because it does work to sort of enhance the power of the television programming.
Kids TV Grows Up by Jo Holz, The Path to Howdy Doody to SpongeBob. The book is available online. I encourage you, if you are a fan of children's television, like I am, and Joe, and we can go on for another hour talking about this topic, you want to pick up a copy of this book. Joe, it's always a pleasure to catch up with you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Paul.
And again, you want to pick up a copy of that book, and next time you sit down in front of the television and watch a children's TV show, just think of our conversation here on the Philly Factor. Until the next time, my name is Paul Perrello. Thanks for being with us. And they do the cutaway shot. Good job.